I'm Arif Ansari. Coming up in the Northwest, rescuing the victims of sexual exploitation, the charity changing the lives of women trafficked for prostitution.
I was repeatedly beaten and raped. That was my life until I was 19.
And joining us this week, the Conservative MP for Chester, Stephen Mosley, and Yasmin Qureshi, the Labour MP for Bolton South East. Welcome both to the studio. Yasmin, the word is that unemployment's down. It looks as if the economy's healing. How do you feel about that?
Well, of course, it's always a good news to know that the employment is falling down. I'm not sure if the economy is necessarily healing, because one thing we notice is, of course, the wage rates have gone down considerably, which is not also a very healthy sign at all.
I mean, Stephen, that is the main criticism, actually, that in terms of people's living standards, this is the greatest squeeze in living memory.
It has been, yes, but it has been a very difficult period of time, and we are aware that things are proving to be very, very difficult, and we are trying to make sure that things turn the corner, and we are seeing these good unemployment figures. Unemployment is down. It's down 25% in Chester since the general election, so there is good news out there, but there's still a lot that needs to be done.
OK, well, I don't like to worry you, but a report out this week says that here in the Northwest, we're at greater risk of dying early than anywhere else in the country. The worst on that list of 150 local authorities is Manchester, but not far behind are Blackpool, Liverpool, Salford, Mosley, Blackburn and Tameside. So can we just blame social deprivation? Well, the report by Public Health England says we can't, because it's compared them with similar places elsewhere. So why, after years of funding and public campaigning, hasn't the story changed? Claire Hamilton reports.
Burgers, fizzy drinks, cigarettes, booze and a lack of exercise. Lifestyle choices reducing the lifespan of people living in the Northwest. The early death league tables already alarmed local authorities, now responsible for public health in England, who say it oversimplifies complex health problems.
Some council areas have a legacy of better interventions than others. So this is really about putting that on record and allowing a conversation to understand why is it some areas are doing better than others.
The report shows people living in the worst performing area, Manchester, are more than twice as likely as people in Wokingham in Berkshire to die before the age of 75.
Millions of pounds every year are spent on healthy living campaigns like these, but public health experts say the message isn't getting through.
For folk living in more disadvantaged areas, they are trapped in poverty. They didn't choose to have a crummy house, they didn't choose to send their kids to a weak school, they just didn't have the choice. So to pick on the victims and say it's their fault to be poor, their fault to be weak, powerless, their fault to be unhealthy is outrageous.
In Manchester this week, the big health bus was taking its healthy living message on the road.
A lot of people don't actually access services, so we're bringing the service to them and we're providing them with the information and support that they need to make health changes.
In Rotherham, where Jamie Oliver's school dinners crusade made national headlines, the report seems to show deprivation has not been a barrier to reducing premature deaths, but not everyone's convinced.
Rotherham's got its own protective factors, and quite honestly I'd be sceptical that obesity interventions targeted at a few people are going to make such a difference.
So as local authorities get to grips with public health, will they be able to change our tastes?
So, Stephen, what's the point of this new table and this new website?
Well, the reason why the government have published all this information is to allow local authorities to see what the situation is in their own areas. If there's a particular problem with smoking, with obesity, with drinking, it allows councils to look and say, this is a problem in our local area and this is the action that we need to take to solve it.
Yeah, but the problem really, fundamentally, is poverty.
Well, if you look at the figures, and we heard from the film, it's not really poverty, it's actually incidents of things like smoking that leads to cancer, it's alcohol abuse, it's obesity, and local Authorities that tackle that, we saw on the film some of the examples where local authorities with high levels of deprivation are tackling these things, and it is having an effect on the mortality figures.
Yes, I understand what you're saying, but Professor Capewell there from Liverpool University making pretty clear that fundamentally the real issue here is actually one of poverty. It's about whether you've got a job, it's about whether you've got a good education.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one of the reasons why we're looking at these situations and saying that people are better off in a job, they are better off in a work. So it leads on to the entire welfare agenda that we've got, to reform the welfare system and to enable and encourage people to go out there, get jobs and play an active and full and healthy role in society.
Yasmin, one of the interesting points and something that Stephen mentioned is that actually, if you do compare places in the northwest which are doing particularly badly, for example, Manchester's the worst, if you compare that to somewhere else which is also deprived, actually we're still doing worse than anywhere else. So what's the explanation for that?
Well, I think there can be obviously a number of combinations. I think poverty has a lot to do with it, but it also may well be that there's issues about education system may be better in some of those areas where, for example, in school, there's better nutrition being provided, there's probably more work being done, extra work, to ensure that people lead a more healthier lifestyle.
Sure, but in a way you're just reframing my question, which is that why are those better in other places than in equivalent places in the northwest?
But it could well be, well, it's got to do also with the fact that how much money is being spent in different areas. For example, Bolton, apparently £67 is per person for public health issues, whereas Westminster and Kensington get £133 per person for the same kind of level of services. So there is a big differences in different councils and the funding they're getting and the amount of money that they can do to help to deal with the issue of education of people.
One thing that's really clear, though, is that national solutions don't work, which is why the government did introduce the system that public health is now the responsibility of local authorities, which came in April. So each local authority, which should be the best people to know what's happening in their local area and the needs of their local area, they're the ones that are now responsible. And the government have ring-fenced £5.5 billion over the next 2 years for public health.
I think people wonder why millions and millions and millions of pounds has been spent over the years and there doesn't seem to have been much progress.
I would tend to think, because we're looking at through the NHS previously, so we're looking at a national situation, and as we've seen from the film, differences in local areas, there are differences, there are different needs in different areas, and if you try and have a national approach, it doesn't work. By going down to that local level, giving the money to local authorities so that they can decide what happens in their local area, we can start to get rid of some of these discrepancies.
Well, I have no problem with the fact that local authorities are being asked to look into this issue and the fact they're going to get some funding. The question is how fair that funding is going to be for each of the local authorities, and obviously then to see how it works out, because up to now, of course, public health issues have been part of the national agenda. I think it's right that local authorities are being given... Local authorities are being given this...
On the funding situation, initially everybody's going to get the same funding as they got previously. However, with time, when we've seen which areas are working, being more effective, that funding will change. So the funding is concentrated
but we had less funding in some parts.
Areas.
I mean, for example, Bolton has the same capacity.
Let's leave it there and move on. A shambles and a catastrophe. That was one recent verdict on the government's attempts to tackle people trafficking. Accurate figures are impossible to obtain, but you can be sure that many women will be living in the northwest virtually prisoners and many trapped in the sex industry. Now, one charity in the region is trying to rescue them. Elaine Dunkley has been invited to meet two of the women. Her report does contain descriptions of abuse.
It's thought that thousands of people are smuggled into the UK every year, with many of them being forced to work in the sex industry. But girls from the UK are also being trafficked, exploited and abused. We've been speaking with two victims from the northwest who are too frightened to be identified.
I didn't get fed, I got hit, raped.
Natasha's story is harrowing. At the age of 14, she went on holiday to the Mediterranean and was befriended by a man who sold her into a life of sexual slavery.
I was forced to sleep with over 100 men in the space of 15 to 18 hours. I was in pain. They tell me to do it without condoms. I was repeatedly beaten and raped. That was my life until I was 19.
I was just a normal 14-year-old girl, I suppose. I liked shopping, hanging out with my friends, going on Facebook. But one night that all changed. I met this woman at my local takeaway who I kind of knew. She invited me to a party and she seemed really nice, so I went along with her. When I got there, I felt really uncomfortable. There was a group of men and she forced me to have sex with one of them. She said she'd taken photos of me and would put them on Facebook so everyone would know. And from there, the blackmail continued. In the end, I was being forced to have sex with up to 4 men a day. She'd take me all over the place so men could force me to do things. And I felt embarrassed and worthless. I'd caught STDs and all sorts. I tried to kill myself a couple of times.
It's just incredible to think that in our time now, women are being forced and coerced into a sex industry.
Both women were eventually rescued by the charity SAFE, which is based in the Northwest. It's been set up by 3 former police officers who work closely with the sex industry in order to rescue victims who are being exploited.
We get information from people who really do know about the types of threats that are out there. Those calls come from sections of the sex industry, from men that sleep with women and from women that work in the industry. And we can get real information about women that are trafficked or women that are underage.
The Home Office believes that there are around 4,000 victims of sex trafficking in the UK, but many fear this is just the tip of the iceberg.
I think the honest answer is, in the same way that many of the people you've talked to, we don't have a very good handle on what is the size of the problem.
The Home Affairs Select Committee are calling for a coordinated approach in tackling the traffickers.
This information does need to be held centrally across the 4 jurisdictions of the UK. I think a commissioner, a czar, a head person with overall responsibility is what many organisations want, and it's a recommendation that I'll be putting forward.
The criminal underworld earns millions of pounds from trafficking and will not easily give up illegal earnings. The challenge for police forces is to find the traffickers and to persuade those who have been abused to give evidence.
Keeping the public safe is one of my top priorities. It's also a very serious priority for Merseyside Police. They're one of the few forces in the country to have centralised public protection services so that they have specialist units working to protect children from sexual exploitation, working to prevent trafficking of vulnerable people.
The cycle of abuse often makes victims feel isolated and alone, and traffickers rely on this to keep them in the shadows. But both Jodie and Natasha say, with the help of SAFE, they've been able to escape a life of exploitation.
I started getting my self-confidence back. I go to college. Ever since the charity came into my life, I know what the word freedom means.
And we're also joined by David Anthony, who used to be head of specialist operations at Greater Manchester Police. So, David, thanks for coming in. How much of a priority is trafficking for the police?
Well, trafficking will be a major priority for the police, especially the exploitation of vulnerable young girls who are then subjected to the most horrendous ordeals and abuse. So, obviously, trying to find out who's behind that and to prevent them getting involved in this type of life, which is just absolutely horrendous for them, is a major priority for the police. The problem they will have, as we've discovered recently with all the grooming cases and abuse within the home, is what is the extent of people that are actually being trafficked into the country, and where are they being kept in safe houses to be abused in the way they are. So
a priority, you believe, but to what extent do you think that the police are actually having success? Because clearly this charity believes that there's more that could be done.
I think that's a fair assumption that a lot more could be done. We know that this is linked to organised crime. There are very serious criminals behind this who are bringing girls into the country or trafficking girls within the country, putting them into safe houses. They're then subject to the most appalling degradation and abuse. So it's getting that handle on the links to organised crime and how these girls are being brought into the country. So it's not just an issue for the police, it's an issue for social services and law enforcement at the borders, how they get into the country.
Is the issue here that it's a very difficult crime to identify and solve, or is it that the police have other priorities as well?
No, I think it's a difficult crime to solve because you know, these girls in lots of cases have been trafficked into the country. So how are they getting in through the border agencies' checks without being alerted? And then once they're in the country, they're put in these safe houses. So I think there is a great deal that could be done around the awareness. You know, people must see young girls being brought into houses. They must see the amount of people that are coming into these houses to then abuse these girls.
Yasmin, what's the solution here, do you think?
The solution is actually you have to approach it with a number of different approaches. One is the police, and they've got to be resourced properly on this. Secondly, actually our social services. Thirdly, schools themselves need to be much more vigilant about what's going on in the classrooms, and also about the fact that children must be made to feel that they are comfortable, young people, about being able to approach their teachers, about able to approach adults. And adults, i.e. parents and others, have to be informed of the fact that this is actually a much bigger problem than we think it is. Because I think so far, up to now, in the last few years, maybe people are more talking about all these issues about sexual exploitation, abuse and trafficking, but actually it's been there for a very long time. And
is it a problem in Bolton, in your constituency?
I've not had too much problem of trafficking. I've not come across a case of a trafficking, but I know that there will be sexual abuse and things like that within the home taking place, not just because you know, Bolton is particularly susceptible, but because across the whole country there will be within the home sexual abuse taking place. And I think what it is the fact that we as a society need to recognise the fact that it's actually a much bigger problem than we think it is. I mean, I can remember 15 years ago, 20 years ago, prosecuting men for trafficking women and pushing women into prostitution, beating them up, you know, effectively their pimps, forcing these young ladies to carry out prostitution. So it's not something new. It's just that perhaps now finally people are willing to come forward, people are willing to talk about it, and the authorities really must be given much more resources to deal with it, and it must be a joint-up approach.
Well, resources are pretty scarce, as you know. Stephen, what do you think? Why is the government not seem to get a grip on this?
Well, there has been a huge change in opinions. We heard about the situation a number of years ago, and now it really is a focus. The government in 2011 launched its trafficking policy and trafficking strategy, and it had four main strands. The first strand was identification and support for the girls, because if you can't identify the girls, then you can't do anything about it. Secondly was working in foreign countries, mainly Eastern Europe, to try and solve the problem at source. Thirdly, working with border control to make sure that they've got the resources, but they also have the skills to identify girls when they're being smuggled in. And lastly, is to have a joint approach from the police. The creation of the National Crime Agency this year, bringing everybody together, so there is a big focus on this really serious.
But Stephen, the evidence given to the Home Affairs Committee is quite contrary to that. It points out that there are 17 ministers with different bits of responsibility for it. There's no coordinator to deal with this issue. There's a complete lack of figures in terms of it. So actually, it's not a rosy picture as you seem to be painting.
I'm not saying it's a rosy picture at all. It's a brutal, abhorrent crime, and any situation is
but in terms of the response...
In terms of response, things have changed. It started initially about 2003, 2004, and the last government did some work, and the current government have continued that on. In 2011, they launched their strategy, and with the creation of things like the National Crime Agency this year, we've actually got all of the police focused on this really abhorrent and brutal crime.
Do you feel reassured?
I'm not feeling reassured at the moment, but can I just touch upon this issue? I remember 13 years ago when I was working in Kosovo, actually helping to draft laws regarding trafficking of women, about the issues of safeguarding women, about safe houses, and of course dealing with women when they're being trafficked, because a lot of these women sometimes are brought on the basis they may have a job to come to here, they're offered, but in fact it turns out that actually they're being pimped in a brothel. And therefore we're going to make sure that we've got laws as well and rules which enables these women to feel that they can go to the authorities instead of being prosecuted or being deported without anybody looking at their cases properly.
Final question to David. A lot of talk here about the police needing priorities, needing resources. That's pretty scarce at the moment, isn't it?
Resources are very scarce, but the police will deal with this because this is linked to serious and organised crime. But the intelligence they receive from charities that we've just seen will be vital in actually combating this. But it's not just the police; it is a law enforcement problem.
David Anthony, thank you very much indeed. And if you're worried about anybody, then here's the number for SAFE. Give them a call on 0844 800 8563. That's 0844 800 8563. Time for the rest of the week's news now. Here's 60 seconds. Pay up, Peel. The chairwoman of the Commons Public Accounts Committee called on the owner of Media City to stump up its fair share in corporation tax. Peel says it's done nothing wrong. Priced out of the market, the number of people in their 30s in Cumbria has dropped by more than 10% in 10 years. Campaigners say people can't afford to live there.
We need to keep young people in rural areas to keep the economics going, to keep the community facilities going and to keep the communities viable.
The families of 2 Merseyside men killed in the Algerian hostage crisis took their campaign for answers to Westminster. Paul Morgan and Gary Barlow were among those killed at a BP gas plant. The leader of the BNP and North West Euro MP Nick Griffin fought back after criticism of his visit to the Assad regime in Syria.
Britain's got enough problems on our own plate. We can't afford it and we should keep out of other people's wars.
And Network Rail has rejected plans for a direct train service between Blackpool and London. Virgin Trains plan to appeal. Well, that meeting of the Public Accounts Committee was 3 floors above this studio. Here's what the Labour MP Margaret Hodge had to say.
The company on the whole, at maximum, pays 10% corporation tax. Maximum. That's just totting it up. They do not pay their fair share of corporation tax. When you're using taxpayers' money, it ought to be with companies that pay their fair share back into the communal pot.
Stephen, do you agree with her that Peel should be paying more tax?
What I think we've got is a global tax system that is completely outdated. It was initially set up in the 1920s, and it doesn't take account of the fact that we've now got global communications and global money flows. What David Cameron, the Prime Minister, has done, of course, we've got the G8 summit this week in Northern Ireland, and he's made tackling the global tax system a priority.
So Peel should be paying more tax?
I think that all companies should be paying the tax that they owe. But if
that's what they say they are doing.
But the problem is when you get companies that aren't paying enough, and we've had Peel, we've had other companies mentioned recently, it's not those companies' fault that they're taking advantage of the system. It's us politicians' fault for not actually developing a system which ensures that they pay the right level of tax.
Do you agree with that, or is it actually companies who are doing their utmost in terms of creative accounting to get round the rules?
I think what it is, as you know, the very famous case in which it was said that tax evasion is unlawful, but tax avoidance is lawful.
Yes, there's no suggestion of illegality.
Yeah, which leads to the point, therefore, that it's a question of the rules and systems and structures you have. I think I agree with Stephen on this point that we need to relook at, and we are rightly looking at the whole issue about how taxes should be paid, especially with corporation taxes, with global economy. And I think it needs to be revisited so that wherever it is felt is appropriate level of taxation, the companies should be paying.
Yes, although when Margaret Hodge attacks Peel, we have to remember that this is a company, unlike many others, which is driving forward the regional economy, really redeveloping things.
Well, absolutely right, and that's great that it's doing that. But of course, Peel Holding, like any other company, is subject to the law, and I think they will no doubt apply whatever the law is that exists in the country. And I think the issue here is whether it's Google or Amazon or any of these companies, right? It's the issue is what kind of tax structures we've got, and I think we need to make them more watertight, and we need to recognise that the international it is different now.
Yasmin, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, and also to you, Stephen Mosley. Thank you both, and it's back to London and Andrew Neil.